We have just a few minutes here today to explore what I believe is a vital subject. I need not go into any detail with a group like this about the attack upon marriage as we know it and upon our families and our homes. You know that all across this land and also around the world, that from high places, from people of influence, traditional marriage, and when I mention traditional marriage, I'm talking about biblical, God-given marriage, is under attack. You read about that daily in the newspapers. You hear about it on television news reports. You know what the problem is. It is our purpose here this morning to look for a solution. And I must tell you in the beginning that the solution is God-given. And I believe that the solution to any attacks upon our families and upon marriage can be found in the revelation of God. And if we return again to what God has taught us about marriage, then we are ready to combat any attack that may come. Our homes are all important, not only to our own families, but to the church and to the nation. I don't believe that any congregation of the Lord's people can be any stronger than the families that make up that congregation. And no nation can be any stronger than the homes of that nation. We all are important building stones, building blocks, if you please, in the wall of our national edifice. It was Grace Crowell many years ago who said, so long as we have homes to which men turn at the close of day, so long as we have homes where women are and where children are and women stay, if faith and love and loyalty be found across those cells, then any stricken nation can recover from its gravest ills. And I believe that. And all of us are impressed with the fact that our country is in trouble, and part of the reason is that our homes and our families are in trouble. So our purpose here today is to ask, what does God say in giving us a solution and an answer in regard to the attacks upon marriage and the family and our homes? Now, I don't know much about this subject except what I can read in Scripture. Many years ago, when I was in college, I was preparing to get married to my Arlene. And the president of Freed Hardeman, where I was in school at the time, H.A. Dixon, called me into his office one day. I didn't know what he wanted with me, but it's a little bit scary when you get a summons to the president's office. So I went there in great humility. And he sat me down, and after a little bit of small talk, he said, I hear you're planning to get married this summer. And I said, that's right. And he said, I want to give you some advice. He said, if you'll turn around and look on the shelf behind you, you'll see that green book. It was a pretty large book, about like Webster's Collegiate Dictionary. He said, take that from the shelf, and I did. And he said, look at the title. And it said, Everything I Know About Women. And he said, leaf through it. And I did, and there was not a single word on any page. And that's about what I know in regard to the practical aspects of this subject. I know what God says by reading what He says, but it's so difficult to build relationships. It's so difficult for me as a husband to build a relationship with my wife because I don't understand her. I tolerate her, but I don't understand all about her. I think I understand her better now than I did more than 50 years ago when we were married. But I don't know much. I do know this, that she is the best thing that's ever happened to me outside of my relationship with the Lord Jesus. And I know that when I'm down, she knows exactly what to say or to do to bring me up again. And when I get a little too lofty, she knows exactly how to bring me back to reality. Some time ago, I just finished preaching on Sunday morning, and we were making that silent trip home where I never speak first, and most of the time she doesn't either. And I had done about as well as I could do that day. And I was feeling pretty good about it all. And I said, not in keeping with my regular habit, I said, "What did you think about the sermon today?" And she said, "What did you think about it?" And I said, "Well, I thought it was pretty good. I did about as well as I could do." And then I said something very dumb. In the form of a question, I said, "I just wonder how many truly great preachers there are in the brotherhood today." Without a hesitation of a second, she said, "Probably one less than you think." So she knows how to build me up, but she knows how to keep me in reality. But I don't understand her very well. But I just know that I love her more than life. And I believe the solution that we're looking for is that we, as the salt of the earth and the light of the world, must establish and maintain Christian homes. With all that's implied in that. And today, I want to look with you at two basic passages of Scripture and make some observations and some applications in the time frame that we have today, hopefully being helpful to somebody as we build our homes for God, which is, after all, the best statement that we can make in regard to traditional home life. And the first of these passages is Ephesians chapter 5. We'll look at two. One is Ephesians chapter 5. The other is 1 Peter chapter 3. And we're talking about building relationships in our families as we build homes for God. In the passage that's found in Ephesians chapter 5, it's interesting to me that the relationship between husband and wife and parents and children is introduced by the principle of mutual submission. Paul had just said, among the other walks of the letter to the Ephesians, walk wisely, walk carefully. And he emphasized in the careful walk that we are to understand what the will of the Lord is. And we are to be filled with the Spirit of God. And he gives us some indications as to how that is possible in understanding and applying the will of God and being filled with the Spirit. He shows us that we are to be people of worship, people of thanksgiving, therefore people of prayer. And he closed that by saying, submitting one to the other out of reverence for Christ. And isn't it interesting that he then goes immediately into relationships between husbands and wives? And yet I dare say that most husbands, as they read, submit to one another, Wonder how that fits into what Paul says later. Because if husbands know no other passage of Scripture by heart, they know this one: wives, be in submission to your husbands. But he doesn't start there. He says, submitting one to the other out of reverence for Christ. The principle of mutual submission is simply that we know we are to serve the needs of others. Whether it be husbands serving the needs of wives, wives meeting the needs of husbands, parents meeting the needs of children. The principle of mutual submission is the principle of sacrificing self for the welfare of another. And that is where it begins, and that's where it must begin. Because if we learn that truth, then we can build successfully with the help of God upon the foundation of His Word as we establish and maintain our homes. The greatest example of the principle of submission is Jesus Himself, who in Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 and following, is said to have left the glory of heaven, where He was the object of angelic worship. And He laid that aside and came into this world and was born as no one has ever been born. He became a human being. But as a human being, He humbled Himself in becoming a servant. The Lord of glory became a servant, a human being who would be despised and rejected of men. And then, taking upon Himself the form of a servant, He died. And He did all of that for us. He practiced submission. Submission to the will of God and submission to our greatest need. Now Paul says in Ephesians chapter 5, you submit one to the other out of respect or reverence for Christ. And you will notice in this reading, and it's a rather lengthy reading, from chapter 5, verse 21 down through the end of the chapter, that Paul begins with wives and ends with wives. He first of all says, wives, be in submission to your husbands as unto the Lord. Your first responsibility is to the Lord, so you submit to Him in doing His will. Now you are in submission to your husbands. And he closes it in the last verse by saying, wives, respect your husbands. But in between those 2 points, he says a great deal to husbands. And if the husbands will get that right, then the submission part with which it begins and the respect part with which it ends will be easy for the wives. You see, the problem is that we husbands get all of that in the middle mixed up. And there are 3 things, basically, that Paul says to husbands. The first is, he says that the husband is the leader. The husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ also is the head of the church. And head is not so much the boss, everybody does what I say, as it is that the husband is the leader. And if there is a single need in the families of America, I think it would be this, that men be returned to their rightful place of leadership in the family. And among Christian men, being the kind of spiritual leaders that God intends for us to be. For a husband to say, you know, I leave religion to the wife and kids, is to abdicate his place that God has granted him and given him. He is the spiritual leader. He is on the cutting edge. He is the one who says, follow me and I will help you get to heaven. His wife is a better person because she's married to him. His kids are better kids than they would have been otherwise because they're He is their daddy. And He is their spiritual leader. And He is saying in effect to them, follow me as I follow Christ. And a lot of husbands are falling down as being leaders in their families. He should be the leader in family worship. He should be the leader in seeing that his wife and kids are in worship on Sunday, that they practice on a daily basis the Christianity that they profess on the Lord's Day. First of all, he is a spiritual leader. The second thing that Paul says to husbands in Ephesians 5 is, husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave Himself for it. Now, I get my first clue as to how I'm to love my wife by Paul's description of Christ's love. Love your wife as Christ loved the church. Now, first of all, we're aware of the fact that love is a choice, aren't we? Love is a decision. Love is not just something emotional. It is a thought process and a decision that we make. Now, I know we talk about falling in love, and I don't object to that. But it sort of makes it accidental. I just fell in love. It's like walking across a creek on a log. I just slipped and fell. I didn't mean to fall. I just did it. But the love that a husband has for his wife is a clearly made decision, in which he is going to do what is best for her. He makes that choice and he dedicates his life to that. So first, I know it's a choice. The second thing that I see here is sacrificial love, as Christ loved the church and gave Himself for it. He is willing to give Himself for her welfare. It goes back to the principle of mutual submission. But also, the husband's love for his wife, it's a decision and it's sacrificial, but it also is undeserved. Christ didn't love us because we deserved it. He loved us because He loved us. And that's the way we love our wives. We don't just love her when she's good. We don't just love her when she does the way we think she ought to do. We just love her because it's undeserved. And it's also an unconditional love. Christ did not say, I will love you when, or I'll love you if. He just said, I love you. And you do not love your wife when she conducts herself just as you think she should. Or you don't love her if she does what pleases you. You just love her. Now, what does it mean to have this kind of a decision, a sacrificial, undeserved kind of love? Well, there are some words that I have written in the margin of my Bible. You know, after all, that's what those white places around the top and sides of your Bible are for, is to make notes of things that you want to be sure you remember. And I made some notes in the margin of my Bible because I don't want to forget this point. It is my best interests that are served when I love my wife as Christ loved the church. And I wrote 3 words here. One of them is that when I love my wife as Christ loved the church, I'm going to talk to her. Did you know that in a survey of wives, the number one problem they had with their husbands was that he doesn't communicate well? And we don't, do we? And when the wife says to her husband, we need to talk, he's likely to say something intelligent like, what about? The fact of the matter is, she wants to talk about everything, but she wants to talk about us. She wants to talk about our family. She wants to talk about our dreams, our hopes, our aspirations. She wants to talk about home. And husbands make a big mistake when they don't understand. She wants to talk, but what does she want to talk about? Communication. One of the past presidents of the American Association of Marriage Counselors said that in all of his work, he found that 95% of troubled marriages lack proper communication. And I've just got to tell you that most of the time we guys are the ones who are leading the way in the breakdown of communication. Because we can, out there in business, negotiate a multi-million-dollar contract, but when we get home, we become mutes. And when we communicate with our wives, it isn't to communicate and do something else. You can't communicate and watch the evening news. You can't communicate and read through the mail. If you're going to communicate, it means full attention. And that's what some of us are not willing to give. But wives are longing for communication with their husbands. And they tell us that they need 1 hour a day of communication. It doesn't even have to be all at the same time. It can be a few minutes here and a few minutes there, but an hour every day. And I just wonder if we're willing to make that communication happen as husbands so that we can build strong family lives for our wife and our kids. The first word that I wrote down here was talk. I wrote another word down, and it's touch. Did you know that your wife needs touched? And a group of women said, in answer to the question, how much? She said 8 to 10 a day. 8 to 10 times a day she needs her husband to touch her. Now, that isn't any kind of sexual innuendo. It's just touching. And she needs 8 to 10 of those a day. Do you ever go through an entire day and never touch your wife? That's why you're having difficulties. She needs to talk and she needs your touch. And additionally, your wife needs romance. If you're going to love your wife, you need to talk to her, you need to touch her, and she needs romance. And we're all mixed up about that one. Because you see, for a man, romance is sex. For a woman, romance is an atmosphere. And those two things do not necessarily go together. Creating an atmosphere is what romance is about. And I can hear some husbands saying right now, I'm not into that romance stuff. Well, that's why you're in such trouble at home. And you say, well then, what is romance? I don't even know what it is. What's romantic? I'll tell you what romance is. Romance is whatever she thinks is romantic. So ask her, on a scale of 1 to 10, what is romantic to you? She'll tell you. And she knows. But I want to give you some suggestions, if I may. Romance is letting her know you think about her. So romance is calling her during the day when you're busy and don't have time to do it. Just tell her you're thinking about her. Romance is sending her a love card in the mail. Romance is leaving her a love note in the morning when you leave the house. Romance is bringing her some small gift at the end of the day for no special reason. Now, if you haven't ever done any of that, and you decide you're going to start, you need to start slowly and carefully. A guy decided he needed to be more romantic, so he made the decision that he would stop at the florist on his way home one evening and buy his wife a dozen roses. And he thought it would be clever, instead of going around and pulling in the garage and going in the back door as he always did, to just park out front and go in the front door. So he was very proud of himself. He pulled up in front of the house. He went up and he rang the doorbell. And he's standing there with a silly grin on his face, holding that dozen roses. And his wife came and she opened the door, and as soon as she saw him, she broke into tears. And he said, "What in the world is the matter?" She said, "I got news today that her 10-year-old daughter got a 0 because she didn't hand her homework in. When Junior came home from school, he was riding his bike, he had a wreck, and he broke one of his permanent teeth. And this morning the baby poured out syrup on our new carpet, and now you've come home drunk." So we have to be careful, but I'm telling you that romance is a part of your loving your wife as Christ loved the church, loving your wife as you love yourself. And so I would challenge you. Ask her what is romantic, and do that. Romance is an atmosphere. Look at these two scenarios. You get up early in the morning, you leave home without ever having any communication with your wife. You're busy all day, and so you have no communication during the day. In the afternoon, you come home, you're tired, you come in, you say hello, and what's for dinner, and where's the mail? You go through the mail and you find out what for dinner. You go in the living room and watch the evening news, perhaps leaf through the newspaper. In a little while, your wife, who has been as busy as you have been all day, calls you for dinner. You go in, fix you a plate, go back and sit down in front of the television and eat it. And when you're finished, you go maybe and put your dish in the sink or just leave it by your chair. After dinner, she cleans up the kitchen and does the family wash. And about 10 o'clock in the evening, you both fall exhausted into bed, and you reach for your wife and she doesn't respond, and you wonder why. But just suppose that morning, before you left the house, maybe you're leaving early and she's still in bed, and you leave her a note on the dining room table, "I love you." And that day, during the day, you find a time to call her and to tell her you're thinking about her. And what difference would there have been when you arrived home that evening if you had gone to the kitchen and said, "How can I help you finish up dinner?" And what difference might there have been had you sat down at the table and relived your day with her? And what difference would there have been if you had said after dinner, "I know you're going to do the laundry, so you go do that and I'll clean up the kitchen"? And what difference would there have been after you finished all of that if you sat on the couch and held her hand as you watched your favorite television program? And then you went to bed. Do you suppose there might be any different approach than there might have been otherwise? That's what I'm talking about in romance. Husbands are to love their wives, and that includes talking and touching and romance. Ephesians chapter 5 says that He's the leader. Ephesians chapter 5 says that He's the lover. And it closes by saying that He is to be loyal to her. You'll notice down at the end of Ephesians 5 that it says, for this cause shall a man leave his father and mother. And it takes us back to the Genesis account. And he will cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh for life. That's God's plan. We interrupt God's plan, but that's His plan. That we be loyal to our wives, and that wives be loyal to their husbands. I want to give you briefly an anatomy of an affair. A husband meets some woman at work or across the backyard fence or the PTA meeting. It doesn't matter where. But he's infatuated by her. And he finds himself thinking about her at other times. And finally he makes a telephone call. He knows he shouldn't, but he did. And he got some kind of a thrill out of that, and so he begins to call her regularly. And then the day comes when he wants to meet with her. He wants to take her to lunch, but they go across town because he doesn't want anybody to see him. He knows this isn't right. And maybe they do that for a while, and then one day they touch. And that soon becomes a full-blown affair. He didn't intend for it to happen. Just got into a situation that should never have occurred. I don't know about you, but I'm disturbed about men, and even men in the church, who drink more coffee with somebody else's wife than they do their own. And my advice would simply be, if that even begins to take place, that you stop it and that you go home. That's where your heart has to be. That's where your commitment must be. And you are loyal to her and to her alone. Paul says that a husband is to be the spiritual leader of his family. He is to be the lover of his wife. And he is to be loyal to her. And I'm telling you that if a husband will be the leader and the proper kind of lover, and he will be loyal to her, there isn't a woman alive who will not submit to him and respect him. That's Ephesians chapter 5. Not in detail, but enough for us to think about for a long while. Now, let's come quickly to 1 Peter chapter 3, because I want to say a word or two about Peter's approach to this same situation. In 1 Peter 3, whereas Paul had said something brief about the wife in the beginning and at the end, most of what he said was to the husband. In 1 Peter 3, most of what Peter says is to the wives. And he is demonstrating what a tremendous responsibility a Christian wife has, even if she's married to a non-Christian husband. She has a tremendous influence for good if she lives a faithful Christian life. And Paul goes into some detail about that. Or Peter goes into some detail about that. But I want you to notice, if you will, that Peter just makes one statement to husbands. Now, I may know what you husbands are thinking right now. You're probably thinking, you spent all that time talking to us from Ephesians chapter 5, and now in 1 Peter 3, you're going to talk to us again. That's right. And the reason I'm going to do that is twofold. One is, I don't say too much to women about marriage because my mother did not raise any fool. The other reason that I don't say as much about women as I do men is because men need more help than women do at this point. So just take that for whatever it's worth. But here's what Peter said. 1 Peter 3, verse 7. Husbands, likewise dwell with them, your wives, with understanding. with understanding. I told you in the beginning, I don't understand much. Do you know why it's so difficult for men to understand women? It's because we're different. We're not just different physically, we're different. We're different spiritually. Did you know that women are inherently more religious than men are? Just look in any church. We're different emotionally. We're different as to how we respond to various things that happen to us in life. We're different. And Peter says, dwell with your wife according to knowledge. In other words, you got to get to know this strange and lovely and wonderful creature that God has made that is so different from you. Do we need demonstrations that we're different? Notice how men and women look at life. When women get together, they talk with each other about their husbands, their homes, their children. When men get together, they talk about their accomplishments, about their work, about their favorite sports team. Totally different. Have you ever noticed how men and women watch a ball game? Man and woman go to a football game. They're in the stadium. They go with some friends. Where do the women want to sit? By each other. Because they're going to be talking during the game. And at the very end of the game, the home team is driving for the final score. And on the final moment in the game, a touchdown is thrown in the corner of the end zone and the home team wins. And the husband turns to his wife and says, did you see that? And she says, see what? We're different. We need to understand that we're different. We need to know that wives don't always say exactly what they mean. We live about 15 minutes from the church building. If we leave 1 minute after 30 minutes before the service begins, as far as I'm concerned, we're late. And so while my wife is finishing up getting ready, I used to go in the bedroom where she was and pace back and forth. I learned early that wasn't good. But one day she's running later than usual and I go into the bedroom and I didn't say anything. I'd learned better than that. And she turned to me and said, look, we got 2 cars. Why don't you just take the other car and go on and I'll come later? That sounded like a great idea to me and I said, okay. She said, don't you dare leave me. Well, she said something, but it wasn't quite what she meant. What she meant was, if you just go in there and sit down for 3 minutes, I'll be ready. And wives expect us to be mind readers. You come home from work one day, you've had a great day, you feel pretty good, you come bounding in the house. Hello, honey, I'm home, and there's silence. You know she's there. You find her in the kitchen, and she's over the sink, and you say, hi, honey, I'm home, and there's no response, and the wallpaper is a little too tight on the walls, and there are icicles hanging down from the ceiling. And you say something intelligent like, is something wrong? And she turns to you finally and says, if you don't know, I'm not going to tell you. We're different. Dwell with your wife according to knowledge. And I'm going to close with the words of Paul when he said, nurture her. Cherish her. And here Peter says, honor her. We haven't talked here today about parents and children. Such an important theme. But in our families, it begins with us, husbands, basically husbands, and wives. And when we learn how to deal with each other and how to respond to each other in keeping with the will of God, then we are building a home that will not only be a credit to the congregation, but a credit to the nation. And we are inserting into the national wall a stone of stability. And the best way that we can meet the attacks against our families and our marriages, it seems to me, is to build homes that are in keeping with the will of God, to build homes that are Christian homes, to build homes where the husband is the husband and the wife is the wife, and where the parents are parents and the children are growing in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. And that is the way that we meet every obstacle that faces the church of our day. And I just hope that somewhere along the way, that something said here today will foster further study and contemplation so that we may build homes to the glory of God.